partner of the law firm of Chapman and Trotman. She's a former Solicitor General of Grenada and the immediate past president of the Grenada Bar Association. She's also a member of Grenada's Integrity Commission, as well as a past chairman of the Commonwealth Caribbean Association of Integrity Associations and anti-corruption bodies, and of course continues to serve on its executive. A very warm welcome to Lady Anande Trotman Joseph.
Good afternoon, sisters all, especially, of course, first and foremost, our esteemed presenters, and indeed all of you who are our sisters and brothers throughout our Caribbean region and network. I'm excited to join you this afternoon to welcome you all, but also I'm much more excited because this topic is very important for the sisters, especially who are aspiring to transformational leadership, whether it be at a national, regional, or international level. Good governance, of course, is about ensuring that as far as possible, for us Siwilas, we embrace transformational leadership in all that we do. And this good governance that we speak about is really the flip side of the honor that and trust that will be placed upon our shoulders as women who step up to the plate of leadership. Very soon we discover that in reality, that honor requires us to address governance issues of the organizations that we are being expected to lead. For many of us, we have been aspiring perhaps to political leadership, but for us Siwilas, we look at good governance as an holistic concept because we want to work with women wherever they want to lead, be it in their communities or organizations that perhaps are public sector organizations, private sector organizations, wherever they are. So as far as possible, women who want to lead need to be aware of all of the emerging trends around them. They need to be on point. They need to be able to communicate well with the people that they propose to lead. And for those of us who are still getting our experience with organizational leadership, no matter what title we have, we know that this is an emerging exercise, an emerging skill of governing organizations that may change from time to time. So most important, of course, will be the need for effective communications. But sisters and brothers, this afternoon, I will not belabor my welcome remarks because we have a panel of extremely esteemed and able presenters and a moderator who is very well experienced and has led an entire Commonwealth sector on exactly this area of governance. We have had colleagues here who not only led organizations as they presently do, but of course have done so on a regional and international stage. So it would be remiss of me not just to bring a close to my welcome remarks by saying, sisters and brothers all who would have joined that and are joining, that we are at the feet of masters, or should we say mistresses, of good governance and all that it means in terms of inclusivity, whether it be participatory, whether it be accountable, the kind of governance that is one that stands on a foundation of integrity, and so on and so on. But it is for them to share with us as we have this wonderful conversation. And I am here in St. George's, Grenada, and it is storming at the moment, but I know that we will have a very warm and spicy discussion among us about what good governance means for us as transformational women leaders, transformational gender leaders, and leaders in all of the different aspects of leadership. Welcome to you, presenters. Welcome to you all who join us. And I hand over once again to the moderator. And thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much, Lady Anande. Very much appreciated. And I have the distinct pleasure of introducing the moderator for today's event, Dr. Therese and Kremer. We are very, very pleased to welcome a longtime supporter of CWIL, Dr. Kremer. She's a senior democratic governance and political specialist with high-level multilateral and bilateral negotiating and good offices experience. She's currently the new director of the University of the West Indies Institute of Criminal Justice and Security, and in her previous post, worked as the head of the Commonwealth Secretary General's Good Offices for Peace. She is well known throughout the region for her work as a political advisor, her work with Amnesty International, UNDP, and as a consultant on international projects focused on democracy, gender, and policy around the globe. I am very pleased and excited to welcome our moderator for today, Dr. Therese and Kremer.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to welcome everybody to this webinar this afternoon. Thank you very much, Lady Ananda Trotman, for your kind words. And also I'd like to recognize in the audience, I can see the political ombudsman of Jamaica, the Honorable Donna Parchment, welcome. And let's get going. Good day all. My name, as you'd have just heard, is Dr. Therese Kremer. And I'm the new director of the University of the West Indies Institute of Criminal Justice and Security, a position I took up in June this year. And as you have also heard, many of you may be familiar with me in my previous roles at the Secretariat across the governance and peace spectrum. I do also have a background in criminology and crime and justice, part of this thematic area. And as luck would have it, I am back home in the region and happy to be continuing supporting CWIL through my current role here as director of the Institute of Criminal Justice and Security. And it's an area really that I also want to strengthen, both in terms of how we see women's participation and leadership, trying to problem solve issues for the region as well. Thank you for joining us for another timely and fittingly appropriately themed CWIL-led forum, Pathways to Good Governance, Embracing Women's Transformational Leadership. The concept of good governance has gained significant attention in the world, especially in the last decade. In recent years, good governance has gained the attention of economists, political scientists, lawyers, politicians, activists, as well as national and global institutions. Some theories suggest that the concept and importance of good governance can be considered as a prerequisite for economic growth and for establishing peaceful and inclusive societies. But this illustrates the important role of and the need, therefore, for us to ensure that we really look at this from the multi-dimensional aspects that it brings with it. And to help us to shed light on this theme, Pathways to Good Governance, Embracing Women's Transformational Leadership, we have brought a distinguished panel demonstrative of active and notable women's leadership at national and international levels. And joining our tight-knit community of practice, as I'll call us today, we have Her Excellency Ambassador Elizabeth Thompson, former elected Member of Parliament from 1994 to 2008, and also served as a minister of government in a number of portfolios. She was also a senator leading minority business in the House in Barbados. She's also served as Barbados's permanent representative to the United Nations. We also have Ms. Tonni Brodber, the current representative of UN Women Multi-Country Office. She served also as a deputy representative at UN Women for Multi-Country Office. She was previously team leader to advance gender justice in the Pacific program with UN Women in Fiji. And Tonni, I think I remember meeting you up there when we were doing some work. Gender specialist for the UNDP program also in South Africa. And she has lectured in China in the field of international relations. We're also pleased that Ms. Therese Turner-Jones could join us today. She's the general manager for the Inter-American Development Bank in the Caribbean and is also the country representative for Jamaica. In that role, Ms. Turner-Jones oversees the bank's operations in Barbados, Guyana, Jamaica, Suriname, Barbados, and Trinidad and Tobago. And she has over 20 years of experience in the areas of macroeconomics and economic development, and has also held key positions in the IMF. Welcome again, ladies and gentlemen, and for those watching and listening to us from across the Caribbean and on Civil's live stream and elsewhere across the world, I hope you're able to hang out with us for the entirety of this conversation. We would welcome your questions, so please do use the chat feature on Zoom to ask questions throughout the conversation. And we aim to take as many of your questions as possible, but we also want to ensure that the session moves seamlessly forward. You know, sometimes these Zoom meetings can give you Zoom aches, and we don't want to have that today. So we want to move it along quite quickly and also very substantively as we hear from our panelists. Please do ask your questions according to the theme we are discussing. So let's get going. In recent years, good governance, on the other hand, has been seen as a characteristic of participation, consensus, accountability, transparency, responsiveness, efficiency, ethics, equitability, respect for the rule of law, equality. And then transformational leadership is one framework that, when employed efficiently, is conducive to enabling good governance outcomes and improving its outcomes. And during a most testing time for the entire world, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the small states in the Caribbean, as the rest of the world, but because of the particular vulnerabilities of this region, the need for both good governance and transformational leadership is really urgent and necessary. Arguably, the world has been impatient for it. The role of women's leadership during this period has been tested during this pandemic, and we have seen some women leaders seize the moment to provide the kind of leadership required transformatively. And with that said, and noting the necessarily impatient clarion call made at the recent United Nations General Assembly by the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, QC, for global leadership, even as she admirably demonstrated leadership of her own, I would like to welcome our first speaker, Ambassador Elizabeth Thompson. Ambassador, you have served at the United Nations. You have also been a government minister. You are acutely aware and familiar with the issues of good governance and sometimes the challenges of the outcomes that our citizens would like to see. Welcome to the floor, and we're impatient to hear of your views on this topic and how you'd like to share with our region today. Over to you.
Good evening, everyone. Really good to be sharing a panel. Lady Anande, this is a friendship that goes back a long way, and even if I'm not seeing you in the flesh or face to face, it's great to see you on the screen and connect virtually. Only last week I shared a panel with Tonni Brodber, so nice to be seeing all of you young people and to be part of this panel. I think that I was really intrigued by the subject that you chose for today's discussion, because it made me ask myself a lot of different things. The traditional styles of patriarchal leadership, particularly in the private sector and politics, has been concentrated on competitive cut and thrust, outcomes oriented leadership, where people are not prioritized, people in the organization, people who are expected to deliver the results. And I don't think that there has necessarily been a focus on ethical leadership. So when one thinks of transformational leadership, one thinks of leadership that is ethical at its core. And thank you, Ms. Kremer, for recognizing Prime Minister Motley's contribution at the UNGA, which is being much talked about, and the call for global moral leadership. Because I think that that resonated with a lot of people because of the notion of leadership at this time, leadership being needed to be transformational. And when we talk about transformational leadership, we are talking about leadership that is almost inherently female in its approach, nurturing, holistic, caring, focused on the people and their well-being, improving persons, seeing about their growth and their development, so that the outcomes for the organization or the entity or the business are not directly profit-oriented or politically oriented, but they are people-focused. People as your stakeholders, people inside, and by nurturing, caring for, and developing these individuals, then you build a high-performing team, and they deliver on the results for your stakeholders, they deliver on the results for your beneficiaries, whether this is a business or political, the electors, beneficiaries of a service, within the context of any organization. I think that implicit too in the notion of transformational leadership, apart from positive change and a focus on people, is that you deliver on your outcomes through the more personal touch. And there's been a lot of analysis done during COVID about the female leadership styles, and the fact that the women-led countries were the ones which were appearing to do very well, because the focus tends to be again on inclusion. And this is part of a global cry at the moment for inclusion, social inclusion, for people to feel wanted and cared about, for people to feel a sense of hope, for people to feel that there are opportunities available to them and to their children. So if you sum it up then, personal development, nurturing, empathy and caring, inclusion in the decision making, and in helping those involved to receive self-actualization, and that is how you achieve your broader incomes, by building a high-performing team. I'll just close on the point that Ernst & Young has done surveys and analysis which shows that female-led organizations tend to be very high-performing organizations which achieve their results, and that the teams are highly motivated, positive-oriented individuals, and that is because of the female leadership and the characteristics that females bring to leadership. So I'll pause here.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for sharing your thoughts. And it was notable that you picked up on some areas of leadership that sometimes are being are talked down as not being effective enough because of their lack of masculinity. But to see that in this crisis, it is those features of empathy, being people-centered, nurturing, that has actually delivered on some of the outcomes that citizens want. And so perhaps one of the questions that, you know, I'd probably like you to think through and provide us with your views on is then how could we encourage an inclusive approach with male colleagues and others to appreciate the value of these qualities in leadership and in achieving the outcomes that we want for governance?
I think that traditionally, people working in an organization or particularly people working in a business are seen as being disposable. They are factors of production. They irritate you, you get rid of them. The organization isn't making enough money, you downsize. They fail to come into work because their child has a problem, you'll get somebody who can't get pregnant, et cetera, et cetera. So this notion that you don't address the human element, that you don't have to nurture your team, that somehow you can build a high-performing team and get them to be productive without addressing them at the point of their need is now proving to have been a very false notion, and in fact part of the challenge that we have had in the past. And if you start asking yourself as individuals and look around and do analysis of what it is people are asking for, what kind of post-COVID world we need to engineer to make people feel a sense of happiness, a sense of inclusion, and less of the hopelessness. And that is part of the problem we've had with COVID, that it has created a high degree of hopelessness. So unless you are actually building the people, unless you are helping them to see a sense of optimism and a view of the future that is not pessimistic, then you cannot build a high-performing team. In fact, I would argue that you can't have development, you can't have growth, you can't have successful businesses unless you start at this point of the individual and the sense of creation of hope and optimism, because people work hard for, invest in, and give their best to an organization or a group or a business that they feel cares about them and create space for them at the personal level. And it isn't always about income, it is about self-actualization and a sense of being valued and people appreciating your contribution or who you are. So what sort of world do we want to create as we come out of COVID, and how are female leadership traits appropriate for taking us in those new directions?
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And perhaps out of this, it's a challenge also for Sewell and all of us to think of how do we, now that we have identified these tested traits work in a crisis, how do we encourage them into political leadership as well? Because they will give dividends at the ballot box once people now realize that this is the kind of leadership that responds to my needs. The UN Women Rep, Tonni, Brodber, and I have done some work previously on women's political participation. So on this, I'm going to use this opportunity to segue to Tonni. Tonni, you have done a number of work across the UN system, and congratulations again in your role as UN Women Rep. You have done also work on gender justice, on how we empower women in entrepreneurship. And I just wanted to hear your views in terms of, particularly in the context of COVID-19 and some of the multi-dynamic and complex crises that we are seeing now. What are your thoughts on the type of transformational leadership that we need to see, and how can we encourage this more in our women as they assume leadership positions across the world, and particularly noting the small state nature of the Caribbean region?
Thank you so much, Dr. Kremer. I always want to say it's always an honor to be on panels with women of the stature that I'm on panels with, but I've now been on a panel with Ambassador Thompson twice, as she said, in 2 weeks. So I am feeling myself, as they say, feeling very happy to be in this company. I think one of the things that Ambassador Thompson spoke to that is going to be critical for leadership in the political sphere is what people want. And UN Women, through CADRIS, did a study on the perceptions of leadership and what it was that people wanted. And originally what they were looking for in terms of their ideal leader was an older married Afro-descendant man. But when you started to look at the qualities that people said they actually wanted that made them feel secure, those qualities, they aligned more with women. And these are the same qualities that the Harvard Business Review study that looked at why women in leadership during the COVID-19 pandemic seem to have been doing better. It wasn't just that women were perceived to be doing better during the pandemic. They were also rated as more effective leaders before the pandemic. And so we need to kind of start looking at what competence it takes. It takes initiative. That was something that was highlighted. Agility, inspiring and motivating others, really looking at how do you develop those around you and how do you build relationships. This notion of ethics and morality, and I like to always go back to the definitions because we work in a space where we say a lot of things, but I want to make sure when I'm saying it, I know what it is I mean. Because people say these things and sometimes we're not all on the same page about what it is we actually mean when we say these things. And so when we are concerned with morality, are we really concerned with the principles of right and wrong behavior? Or are we concerned with the behavior that align specifically with certain faith? And that is something that I think our parliamentarians are also looking and working to. How do we integrate these ethics and the discipline around how we manage what is right and wrong in leadership? And so for me, when we're thinking about the parliamentarians, and I think we need to move a little bit more from just what women have to do to the spaces in which we're asking women to work, right? We are asking women who put themselves forward because they believe and we see them inspire and motivate. We see them communicate powerfully. I saw that Ambassador Thompson had to come into Barbados. I don't know if she had to come in, but she did come into Barbados to help with the communications around the COVID-19 pandemic, the collaboration and the teamwork and the relationship building that we expect from women. When they get into political spheres, is this what they are being met with as well? Or are they being left on their own, being asked to answer to civil society because we hold them to account in civil society, as civil society holds us all into account? Are they being asked to answer to a different political system that does not necessarily understand their roles as mothers, their roles as daughters, aunts, everything else? And so this enabling space, what we're asking of women to do when they put themselves forward, is it allowing them to really stand in their power and demonstrate their fullest potential? And I think that's why we need to move from the question of what do women need to do to what is an enabling space for these women who have put themselves forward to be able to thrive. And we need to be honest in the conversation as to whether that exists within our Caribbean SIDS, a space for women to really thrive. And we see data across the region demonstrating right now, while everyone is pushing back in some ways, and I'm being quite frank in this, there's a lot of pushback against gender equality. There's a lot of pushback when we say, well, let's focus not only on the women but also the men, but what are the gender-based discriminatory spaces that are leading to these kinds of outcomes? We say 70% of women are graduating from university. Can't you see the women are doing so well? But when you look at the data, when you look at those who are not in employment, not in education or training, it is still majority women. When you look at those who are being asked to hold up the bulk of the work in the home, it is still majority women. And when you look at those who are the majority of our parliamentarians, it is not majority women. So is it that we are saying that the women who have all of these skills and certification just don't want to be in parliament? Or is it that we are not creating spaces and pipelines that enable them to live full lives while they serve their country?
Thank you very much, Tonni, for that intervention. Very interesting and I think poignant intervention, particularly with how we ensure enabling spaces, because the expertise, the will clearly is there. So are we fostering that? And I think that's a challenge then for all of us, and to how we also leverage our conversations with government, oppositions, and in civil society spaces. How do we ensure that women are enabled to create change? And there's a theory that we all do create project documents and we look for theories of change. So I guess the question then you're saying we should really be asking is, how are we enabling theories of change with the clear qualities that we see present in our women in the region? And I can identify with some of the pushback arguments that you have just stated. In fact, yesterday I was in a conversation about something like this because of the stated effects this is having, the COVID-19 crisis is having, particularly on men. And then there was also, another view. Well, it is also having an effect on women who can't work, so they have to stay home with children who are not at school. And at the same time, they're also dealing with that mental health situation without the societal safety net and gaps to provide that support. So it needs a much more nuanced but holistic and frank approach. And I think perhaps a challenge for us and Lady Anand, I know you're listening, in developing programming and how organizations like the IADB and UN Women, etc., can assist you to create programs that look at these things, how we foster the enabling spaces. I know you're doing some of that, but how can we deepen that? Yeah. And with that, I'd like to go to Ms. Therese Turner-Jones from the IADB, the multi-country officer, general manager there, and also the country rep for Jamaica. Ms. Turner-Jones, you have led a number of initiatives across the region with regards to enabling growth, development, but also looking at it in a sustainable way and ensuring that issues of gender equality are also mainstream. It would be interesting to hear from you, what are some of the main challenges you see from a programmatic perspective as well, of the barriers to some of these enabling spaces. And arguably there, sometimes we innovate away from our strengths. And if, as Ambassador Liz Thompson says, that these are some of the identified strengths of leadership that we have and that our women have demonstrated, how can we tap into those to see better growth, better economic development, better prosperity in our region? Over to you.
Thank you. And I'm going to build on what's already been said, but I want to start with two perspectives, one from theology and one from popular culture, that's going to frame how I'm going to present. So the one from theology is the path of descent is the path of transformation. So descent, transformation. Popular culture, the future is female. It's fascinating that we're having this conversation today, and we're using COVID as a laboratory for looking at where can we improve governance and where the women come in into this conversation. I was shocked this morning when I picked up the newspaper to find on the front page an article quoting Justice Sykes in Jamaica, who was praising the fact that he's seeing more women representing criminals in the justice system. Now, when I first picked it up, I had to read it twice because I thought, is he being patronizing? Why is he saying this? Women have been defending criminals for a while. Why is it that all of a sudden it's come to his attention? But I think what has caught his attention is how differently women present and how our language, the narrative we bring to a story, changes the way, in this case, maybe justice is being seen or justice can be meted out in a way that's very different. So I had to I had a double take. But I say that to say, and that's why I use the future is female quote, because we're seeing that not just at the corporate level, at governmental levels and civil society, we are shifting our mindsets to what are the characteristics women bring to jobs and tasks and their view of the world that are causing what I call a transformation to take place. So we have to somehow sink, if we take a theological view of life, we sink to a position where in order to transform ourselves, we have to hit rock bottom. And what we're seeing across the globe is that the traditional patriarchy, as Ambassador Thompson mentioned, is failing us on so many levels to have that transformation, that we live in an equal world where inequality is narrowing. We're actually seeing where inequalities are actually becoming even more gaping across the world. So we need a different approach. So I want to just focus, I use it as background to talk a little bit about three things. And we mentioned at the beginning, what are the characteristics of good governance, accountability, responsiveness, transparency, efficiency, equity and inclusion, and they would include also diversity, a consensus-oriented way of decision-making, and of course, the rule of law. And since this pandemic, what we've seen is various ways of rating whether governments or institutions have been good at any of these. And let's just take responsiveness. How have our governments responded to the COVID crisis? And I think if we were grading these countries on a scale of 1 to 10, I think many of us will come out somewhere in the middle. Maybe some of them are at 5 out of 10. Others are approaching 8 out of 10, but we're not seeing anybody at 10 out of 10, right? Because this is a complex problem. It requires everybody to be involved in the decision making. And what we're seeing across the region is that some governments have gone to a very narrow decision making approach. So those decisions are being taken only at the Ministry of Health level, for example, and maybe the cabinet. Others have gone as far as to say, no, we need a national approach to this. Let's form a national task force. Let's get as many people on board to help solve this problem. And so I think here I'm seeing and I'm feeling as a female leader that women's voices are really absent in this debate, and the solutions coming forward to how to do it. In terms of accountability, a year before the pandemic hit, the IDB had been doing a series of studies about how governments respond to citizens and whether they have a citizen-centric approach to delivering public services. And what we found in the Caribbean especially is that most government agencies couldn't give two hoots about the kinds of services that they deliver. And in fact, for a citizen of a country like Jamaica, for example, and we have the report and it's out, it can take you up to 8 different visits to a particular government office to get one transaction done. Now think about the time that would take for somebody to do something. But 8 visits, I think the Bahamas and Barbados did the best in terms of how many times they had to go to a government agency to get the same transaction done. But our whole sense of how the public response to its citizen in terms of whether it's getting a passport or a driver's license or paying taxes, we have yet to put the citizen at the center of that transaction. It's all about, is it convenient for the public servant to do what they're doing? We don't care if you have to come 10 times. This is the way we do it. And by golly, you don't really have a choice. And I think what we're seeing across the region is that we're fed up. In 2021, we shouldn't have to be making, and in COVID, we shouldn't have to present ourselves physically to the tax office to do anything, because we really should have already migrated to a digital way of solving these problems, as some countries are moving ahead quite quickly, but we know in a country like Jamaica, it's been really slow. So I just want to put it out there that we have a lot more to do on the accountability citizen side. On the issue of what does transformational leadership look like? I think here, It's probably easier to say what it doesn't look like, but I think we can recognize transformational leadership in action. And we have a lot of examples on this panel and in this room. And all of the women present here are here because they want to hear more about how we can do this better. I'll give you some examples of the way we work at the IDB and in my department. So I think it's really important to be able to measure and to be able to monitor whether the governance structure we have in place is working for everyone. So how do we do that? I think we have to create frameworks where people feel that they are empowered. So it's not just about saying you are empowered to speak, but really making that happen. And how do you do that? You do that by getting feedback from your teams. So there are a number of ways you can do this. In our case, we have employee surveys that go out every week to give feedback on whether or not things are going right with them. We ask them what's going right, what's not going right. And if it's not going right, let's try to fix it. But unless we're engaging with our teams, as some people have mentioned here, we won't know, and we won't know what it is that we need to fix. We know from the corporate world and lots of studies, take a 2019 study by McKinsey, for example, the firms that did best on rate of return had at least 25% female leadership on their teams. In my team, in the Caribbean department, 60% of our leaders are women. So that's over 50%. Now, at the IDB at large, is that the target? No. My department is probably doing better than any other department in the whole organization. But we have targets on how many women we want to see in those senior positions in our organizations. So it's important to track these things. It's important to report back to the staff and teams to say, here we are relative to the targets, we're not meeting it, and this is what we need to do to fix that. I think when we see a transformational leader, we know what is present. We know that that leader is responding to a team that's diverse. And I'm not just talking about diverse in gender, because I think that's an easy one to fix. Are there diverse thought represented in that group? Do you have people who not only agree with the boss, but people who are willing to challenge the boss, right? You can't reach consensus unless all the ideas are put on the table. It's not just about meeting the diversity and inclusion targets that your goals that your institution might have. Say in the IDB, we want to reach 44% of women in leadership positions. It's not just about that. But are we also walking the talk? Are we giving opportunities to those women? And to take Tony's point, are we enabling those women to thrive in a way that they can live up to their new responsibilities? Are we doing anything on childcare? I think this is one of the biggest obstacles in the Caribbean, is making sure that we have safe, secure childcare for working women, right? There is hardly in a public institution across this region where there is a daycare located in the same building as the office. I mean, that's basic now for most multilateral institutions. We provide childcare so that the women who are working in my institution and the men who are working in my institution have access to reasonable, affordable childcare, and they don't have to be worried about rushing and leaving the office at a certain time because the childcare, the school is closing at 3 o'clock and they need to get out to pick up the kid and so on. That provides a comfort and security for women to be able to do their work properly, to know that their institution actually cares about them. I want to make a comment about women in the political arena. And I have absolutely zero experience in this, except as a part of the electorate. But I would say that here is where we need a lot of work to be done in the Caribbean, because not only are we seeing fewer women show up, as Ambassador Thompson was mentioning, but we're also now starting to see fewer women even want to become involved in politics because of the nature of it, and because it seems to be a mostly male-dominated, at least at the leadership level, arena. That has to change. We're 50% of the electorate. We want to see 50% of the candidates being female candidates. And until voters start to make parties accountable for this reality you want to see, it's not going to change. So I think there's plenty of work to be done. I'm going to stop there and just say that I think this topic is really important for all the reasons we just mentioned. COVID obviously has disrupted not just the way we work, the way we live, the way we interact with each other. We know that it's disproportionately falling, the burden is falling on women because we're the ones at home having to also deal with the kids who are privileged enough to have access to online learning. We know that there are inequalities abound in education around this region because a lot of children are being left out. So I think we really need to bang our heads together, as Toni is saying, to come up with some really good courses of action to support women around the region. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your timely intervention, Mrs. Turner-Jones. Very important to, I think, what I picked out most from your presentation, quite a number of issues, is how we measure delivery and how we look and how that then can inform accountability and when engage with teams. Earlier, I think Lady Anand also mentioned about governance of organizations and institutions, and you also brought that into fore in speaking about some of the qualities that are required, even as, leadership, women demonstrate leadership in their own organizations. Very important. I'm interested also in the information you shared that fewer women are joining politics, in amidst the noise sometimes in the Caribbean. And because we have such stellar leadership from Mia Mottley these days and, a few bright sparks elsewhere, it can be illuminated to make it seem as if this is a lot, it's the standard. So it's interesting to hear the data that this is actually shrinking and that there is more that we need to do. Some time ago, Civil, and in my previous role and with the UN and UN Women, we did some work working with political parties and how we can encourage them in their selection of women candidates. But this is still an area I think requires a lot of work, and I know it's challenging for international organizations as you consider this because you have to be impartial, etc. But we're going to have to find, I think, some innovative ways where we can get into providing programmatic assistance and conversations with political parties, because particularly in the Caribbean region where we have them as the gatekeepers for entry to parliament, and that's where the selection is done, the conversation should start there at least. And perhaps another avenue for Civil to consider going forward is how we deepen that and how we look for more creative and innovative ways where we can have bipartisan work, specifically with the political parties. And I know UN Women has made some headway with that. So congrats on that. We need to deepen how we do that across the region. Yes, Mrs. Turner-Jones.
So I in the Bahamas, elections were held 2 weeks ago, September 16th, no, last week. And the results of the elections was an overturn, so the opposition won. And so I'm following, the appointments to cabinet, I'm following the appointments to parliamentary secretaries and so on. And for every 3 or 4 men appointed, maybe there was 1 woman appointed. And this is playing out in 2021. It's extremely disappointing. But the IDB, 2 weeks before the election was held, because it was a snap election, we held at the University of the Bahamas a workshop on women in politics, bringing the candidates from the current party, the incumbents, as well as the opposition into the room to talk about, what is expected of them, what would help them to succeed. I think more of that needs to happen. We know when elections are going to be happening, Jamaica next, and Barbados next, and Trinidad next, and Suriname next, and across the region. We need to have more of those conversations, not just to encourage women, but also to build their capabilities to take on those responsibilities. So more Liz Thompsons out there doing this work in the field to help women prepare themselves, because I think it's not as easy as it looks. And clearly there are barriers to entry. And as a Bahamian, I'm extremely disappointed in what I've seen in terms of appointments and how imbalanced the whole cabinet looks. And maybe it's time to say across this region, we need quotas on women in parliament. We need those quotas. We need 50%. We need to see ourselves represented in these decision-making bodies across the region.
Thank you, Ambassador Thompson.
Thank you so much. Excuse me. I'm really happy to hear someone raise the issue of quotas, which is a kind of taboo subject in the Caribbean, particularly because there's a perception that women are doing so well. You know, look at all the university graduates going to banks, going to the hospital, and you're going to see them, and going the legal profession, and all the women are doing so well. But when you break down the Caribbean data, you see that in terms of property ownership, women are not in the majority. When you look at poverty, women are in the majority. When you look at pay, women still receive, depending on the country, between 60 to 80 cents on a man's dollar. Now, I think that what we have to do when we talk about the political sphere is look at a whole of society approach. 27% of female leaders, of leaders across the world at the political level are female. There are about 50 female ambassadors at the United Nations. So that's quarter only of the representatives of the member states being female. Because there are about over 200 ambassadors, so about quarter are female. If you can, yeah, and as I just said, 27% of the global leaders are female. If you come into our region, parliaments tend to have between 10 and 20% female membership. And female leaders in the region are way less than that. But don't just stop at the political. Go, as I said, to property ownership, go to income, poverty indices, and look at things like businesses, female-led businesses, female-led organizations, female-led big corporate entities, female-led boards, or the number of women on the gender distribution of boards, especially of large corporate entities in the Caribbean. The disparity is really great. And what you have to consider is that this is 25 years after Beijing. It has taken us this long to get this short distance. We know that there have been reversals as a result of COVID-19. We also know that research has been done that showed that as at 2019, it would have taken 100 years to achieve gender parity or gender equality if you used a set of indices like income, ownership, representation at leadership levels, etc. And I think the question we have to ask ourselves is, how do we accelerate and embed change and stop the kinds of reversals that we have been witnessing? And I think that a lot has to do with perception, because there's a perception that women in the Caribbean are doing and have done very well. The perception is not the reality. I did a lecture on this whole issue of women's still having secondary status in the Caribbean. And at the end of the lecture, even though I had given all of the data for all of the various indices to support my argument, there were women coming up to me telling me, no, this is not the case. So the perception versus the reality is something, a real fight. And like I said, I think that the question is, how do we accelerate and embed change given where we are 25 years after Beijing, and given the fact that COVID-19 has caused serious reversals? In the answer to that lies, in my view, the way forward.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Someone in the chat said, perhaps you have just found the campaign title for us. Perception is not the reality. That's something for us to consider. And also there's a comment as well that we need more women with an entrepreneurial mindset, because that's where we elevate ourselves as opposed to trying to elevate within the same sphere as men who may feel threatened by women and see women as competition. That's where we may win. Our mindset needs to shift. And I'd like to zero in on that issue, the issue of mindset, because since we're talking about transformational change, perhaps then it is imperative to think about what are the things that actually change this behavior. Because if you're in a room and of your status, you have clearly smashed through a number of barriers, Ambassador Thompson, and you're giving your experience and women still don't believe. They'll tell you we're fine. It is clearly a mindset that perhaps suffers from embedded patriarchal frameworks and systems. And so how do we think through that theory of change to change mindsets? And I remember having a discussion, I think with Sewell in Barbados and UN Women, I think, when we invited, there was a psychologist to one of our forums who, because we wanted to see what are the strategies that we need to put in our programming that really affect mindset. What is the turning point that causes change, that for someone to think I can do this? When you say women need to be entrepreneurial, these are the same women who join partners all over the Caribbean and are able to do businesses from the market. The spirit is there. It's perhaps the belief that we can do it and the mindset change. So there are a number of inherent challenges that perhaps we can probably think through, and perhaps form little working groups, Sewell, to see how we can get some conversations along these separate pathways towards transformational change and input in the Caribbean. At this stage, I'd like to open the floor to our participants, and I'd like to ask my Sewell colleagues to assist me with identifying those who may want to ask a question or a comment. Ideally, we want to limit this to perhaps 15 minutes or 10 more minutes, because I think we have discussed a lot and we have a lot of ideas, but the floor is open for anyone who wants to comment or ask any questions of our panelists.
Thank you.
Dr. Kremer, we have two hands, Honorable Parchment Brown and Miss Abigail McKay. Dr. Abigail McKay. So
thank you very much. Honorable Donna Parchment, so pleased to welcome you to this forum. Thank you for joining us. Good to see you. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Kremer. It's so good to be here. I'm always inspired by my sisters, those who are a little bit older, and even more by the younger ones. And it's good for us to be together to in a way, reassure ourselves that what we're thinking about, what we're talking about is shared. It's not a situation where we're isolated, alone, experiencing and thinking these things. I found the entire presentation so far very helpful and interesting. But I wanted to ask Tonni if she would say a little bit more about the Harvard study that talked about the qualities for leadership, because to my mind, I've heard all the speakers talk about data, and women and men, children, everybody needs at some point to say, okay, a study was done and the study found this. It's not just my opinion, it's a legitimate finding. So this notion that women's qualities are more admired for leadership, yet we have a vision of who a leader is that contradicts that. And I think understanding that better might help us overcome the deficit that we're seeing in opportunities for men to embrace women's ideas and for women to embrace some of these ideas that have been shared. Sorry, long question. So it's about the Harvard study and the issue of qualities.
Thank you. Over to you, Tonni.
Sorry, I didn't know if you wanted me to start right away or you wanted to get all of the questions. I think it is a absolutely fantastic question, because what is it that we say perception versus the reality? So there is, the Harvard study was completed in 2019, and it was research that women score higher on what the leadership skills are intended to be. And I can send the link to the study. And the different capabilities included taking initiative, resilience, whether the person practices self-development, there was a drive for results, but also high integrity and honesty, that moral compass we had been discussing before, as well as the focus on others, which Ambassador Thompson was speaking to. So developing others, inspiring and motivating others. Interestingly, when it came to bold relationships, women also, bold leadership, women also landed in a higher percentile than men did for bold leadership. And that's something that is usually associated with masculinity, that women are more timid. And while it is that women generally have been found to be less averse to risk-taking than men, that does not mean that they are not bold in their leadership choices. As well as building relationships, championing change, not being wedded to a certain idea and adapting, as well as collaboration and teamwork, and connecting to the outside world. And I think this is a really critical one, given the fact that the roles women are expected to play will always go beyond their office space and their formal work. That connection to the outside world is consistent. And I just want to briefly link again to the COVID-19 responses. We had a session, a masterclass session this morning with the Parliament in Trinidad and Tobago. And we kept raising the fact that if you make education policy without taking into consideration unpaid care responsibilities, you are going to create a situation that is extremely challenging for women, for parents, mainly women who are responsible for that home education part of it, as well as the children, right? Because people are human beings. Of course, violence is a choice, but we have been seeing violence in homes where women, there's a quote from a study that UN Women has done that hopefully will be able to be shared soon. It's with the cabinet now, where one single mother said she is losing her mind and she's recognizing she is becoming more aggressive with her children as a result of her frustration with trying to balance her job and homeschooling 3 children, right? But because we keep this in the sphere of women's work, we're not thinking, what does this also mean for the men who have fathered these children? So these leadership skills are, and I'll share that study with you, and I can also share, it's on our website, but the UN Women Cadres Perception Survey, where again, people think this is what they want, but when you break it down to what are the actual characteristics of a leader that you want, it aligns with more feminine leadership. Again, I think we have to acknowledge the micro and the macro. So at the macro level, we can discuss, yes, these are the things that people say, but at the micro level, what changes and weighs on people's hearts and beliefs also includes sacred texts that speak to leadership looking like one specific sex. And if we don't address that and really bring in, because there are many wonderful faith-based leaders who speak to the fact that we need to really look at these texts in a more comprehensive way, because we're leaving out the importance of women's leadership. We get a very narrow perception of what a leader should be that is internalized by women, who often, we have brought up temporary special measures many times, and many of the people who are against it are elected women. And this is something that we need to look into, because temporary special measures are a good idea. Why don't we look at what has worked? What has worked in the Scandinavian countries, what has worked in Rwanda, what works in the world? This is something that has worked. Why aren't we doing it here? And when you start to unpack some of these things, a lot of women don't feel that they should be placed there. And the reason that it is rolled back is the same thing when we had Rosie the Riveter after World War II. A lot of women went into jobs when men were at war. But when men came back, women were expected to go back to the home, because this was that you only go into these spaces if a man can't do it. And we need to start shifting that mindset that all human beings have the potential to lead in their countries, to lead in their homes, we see it, and in their communities. And we need to create the environments where all human beings can do that.
Thank you, Tonni. Abigail McKay, your question.
I don't have a question.
I
I
just
have
want
comment.
to make a quick comment.
Yes.
Just to say too that Ernst & Young has done a lot of survey work on this, particularly in the private sector, and therefore you might want to look at Ernst & Young and some of the empirical data they have collected on women's leadership and how women-led organizations perform.
Thank you, Ambassador Thompson. I'm sure Cyril will be on that and probably getting us a policy brief soon. Abigail, over to you.
I wanted to put on the table the Ambassador Thompson spoke about moving, not just the leadership sphere of parliamentarians perhaps, but all other aspects of leadership. And this speaks to the mindset that Marcus Garvey's "none but ourselves can free our minds" is relevant. It's the paradigm shift that is necessary. And perhaps Tonni and Brodber, we need to consider not speaking of temporary measures or quotas, but speak of the need for new practices, the changes that need to occur. But for you to have a new habit, you have to practice that new habit. And if we can get to a place where we start including those kinds of things, we could address a lot of our historical challenges and difficulties, because the enslavement period also impacts the role of women. And we have to pay attention to that and bring history into this process as well. All of that complicates the situation for women functioning as secondary citizens. Understanding that, yes, we can lead. We do it every day in our households. When you learn how to make a dollar stretch, resolve problems as they come up, et cetera, et cetera. These are elements that women know overall. And if we can take those good practices and utilize our historical background, speak to transparency, accountability, responsibility for what has been our history, we have to break those cycles and bring in new practices. If we speak that way, if we get people on board, that's why the campaign is necessary. And I put in there that perhaps the campaign title is "The Perception is Not the Reality." That's my contribution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abigail, for those comments. From my side here at the Institute of Criminal Justice and Security, I want to place on the table that I be tapping your resources in terms of your ideas for how we can even incorporate women into problem solving this issue across the criminal justice and security spectrum. Crime is one of the issues that is troubling the Caribbean in a number of areas, impacting growth, impacting families, impacting violence. And ICJS would like to start a conversation in partnership as well in how we enable women better in this conversation to assist us to finding the issues and the solutions. We're thinking through how we do that. So any comments on that at this stage would also be welcome. I see Kamala Tewari as her hand up, and I'd like to offer the floor to her as well. But before Kamala speaks, there is also some questions on any advice that the panelists may have for young women who are now operating in leadership spaces and confronting these barriers, and what role, if any, do you see for mentorship of women in creating these enabling spaces? While you think through that as well, Kamala?
Yes, hi, good afternoon all. I joined late, I'm sorry. But I just wanted to add to Ms. Mackay's point about historical background and the impact it has on women. I would like to include indentureship in this conversation, please.
Yes, yes.
Okay, just a point to raise.
Mm-hmm. Could you what are some of the areas that you'd like us to consider?
Well, I mean, if we look at the quota of women that came, when the violence started in the estates and all of that,
Yeah.
and where we are now and where we have come from the plantation system into society as at all levels,
Yeah.
and what I suppose we have common challenges, like all the other groups in Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean, but there are some peculiar ones as well.
Thank you very much for that comment, Tawari. I'm sure that's an aspect that we can certainly look at, the whole issue of slavery, and also particularly indentureship and the effect of women where that is concerned. I'm certain there's an entire school of thought and implications around that perhaps we're not well equipped to go into today, but certainly it possibly deserves its own forum for discussion.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. Panelists, any comments on that and any of the previously raised issues before we I think wrap up?
Sure, I have a comment on this last set of views. You know, we can't take our historical, anthropological history away from our norms, right? And I think what we're hearing is that we need, and maybe Sewell can look into this, and I would like to add religion as another one of the dimensions that you examine, because depending on where we are and how we were brought up, and whether we were brought up by empowering families or whether our families saw the girls in the family as only being able to do X or Y. Yeah. And we know that this still persists in some societies around the Caribbean, Guyana, Suriname, even parts of Trinidad and Tobago, where in Indo culture, I mean, there's a different expectation for men in those families versus girls. And I think in some ultra fundamentalist sort of Christian families, you're going to find some of the same kinds of norms that have prevented women from really becoming or realizing their true potential. So I think we have complex issues when it comes to where women see themselves in society. And just back to the politics question, you know, a lot of us never saw women as politicians. And so if you don't see yourself as a cabinet minister or as a prime minister, now we have lots of great models. I think Mia is everybody's, you know, leader of choice today, Mia Motley. But, you know, for those of us growing up, we didn't see that. So to think of yourself as having a political career as well as other things, it probably wasn't what we were seeing. Now we know our girls are being, our younger women are being exposed to anything is possible. And I want to say anything really is possible today for women. And on that issue of support, I think mentoring and mentorships is one thing, but also finding yourself a support group. So somebody put in the chat, Cheryl Brazard, that, you know, women behaving nicely, we're not the ones that make history. But I think you have to find women who think like you, women who can give you that kind of support. You can find them in your organizations. If they're not in your organization, go look elsewhere for those women. But you really need to have a couple of women in your corner. You need to have your posse so that when something happens, there are people you can turn to for advice. And I think in our institutions, we are building those mentoring connections up so that women really feel supported. And I think for all of us on this, in this webinar today, if that doesn't exist for you already, that's something you can do tomorrow, right? Really important. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Turner-Jones, for that. Any other comments from the panelists?
I wanted to make the point that someone raised the issue of young people and finding themselves in positions of leadership. And I really feel that when women lead, that very often we are made to second guess ourselves. and that we second guess ourselves, even if we are not being made to. Whereas men tend not to second guess themselves when they're in positions of leadership. They make their decision and they move on. I believe that what we have to do is truly accept that we earned and deserve our place at the table. We have to hold that place, help to bring others in, create space for others, and then ensure that we behave in a way that demonstrates that we earned it, that we deserve it, and that our contribution should be valued. And sometimes, I think somebody posted, well-behaved women aren't very successful. And it's true. Sometimes you have to be thought of as a little bit of a rebel, too mouthy, too difficult. All of the negative descriptions of women who are assertive, perhaps even less assertive than men, but simply because they are not wanted to be assertive and we don't perceive it as being appropriate for women to be both seen and heard because they have something to contribute. So I think this position of believing that we deserve this place at the table and creating space for others, not second guessing ourselves, and continually honing our skills to secure that position, and not being afraid to talk about what we have accomplished and what it is we want to do and why we are doing something in a particular way. I think that all of these things are important because there's also evidence, again, I think coming out of Ernst & Young, that very often when female-led teams or female-led organizations perform exceptionally, the kudos are not given to the leader of the organization, but to the circumstances, to the organization itself, etc. We don't say that this is because a woman is leading, but when male-led organizations do well, you hear what exceptional leaders these men are and so on, but women are not praised in the same kind
of way. And that they should be celebrated loudly. I think we should loudly celebrate ourselves.
Just some of the points I wanted to make.
Thank you, Ambassador. Tonni?
I think for me, there are a few things. So for young women, it's really important. Yeah, that mentorship is important. It doesn't have to be direct mentorship in that you've asked someone and they've taken you on as a mentor, but even looking at the way in which other women manage themselves, behave, navigate the space is a powerful guide. And I think the mentorship should be both male and female, because there are a lot of male allies who can demonstrate the ways in which they have not had to follow some of the rules that have been set for women. I think you have to be prepared to fail and dust yourself off. I do think not necessarily our education system has not made us very open to risk. And I think we need to be a little bit more open to risk. And with that will come some failure. And we just need to learn from it. And I think to Ambassador Thompson's last point, false modesty, Maya Angelou spoke a lot about false modesty versus humility. It's one thing to be, I don't know that I'm so good at this. And it's another to say, I'm good at this, but I'm good at this because of those who came before me. I know I'm not the only one who's good at this. I know that I'm part of a broader system. Claim your excellence. And I think that's something we don't necessarily always see, is acknowledging that many came before you and many will come after you, but that you too are adding something absolutely significant to this space. I agree, well-behaved women, because what determines who's a well-behaved woman? I mean, if women had a chance to define what being well-behaved meant, it would mean something different than what sometimes the traditional understanding of good behavior looks like. And that is generally informed by patriarchal norms, So we have to figure out, women will make history, and many women make history pretending to be well-behaved and working within that system. But we all need to also kind of push, not just push, deconstruct some of these spaces that make it very difficult for us to be our full selves and live in our full potential. I think the last thing that I wanted to say, there are two things. The indentured laborship, Absolutely. Indentureship is something we have to be aware of as the former colonization and slavery that we have experienced. We also have to figure out now, how do we move beyond these things that created the reality that we're in? We may or may not get what it is we're asking from those who did lead these systems. Whether we do or not, certain things have to be done that we need to do to make sure that the space is what we want the space to be. And I think to close, you know, the Harvard study and article had a very interesting quote around, based on our data, people want leaders who are able to pivot. And I know Mrs. Turner-Jones had a keynote speak and had an entire program on pivots and pivoting, where Prime Minister Motley gave a speech that also went viral. If we are not willing to pivot, if we're not willing to learn new skills and do things differently, we are not going to see what we want change. And this is a lesson for young women in leadership. This is a lesson for all of us. All of us have the opportunity, regardless of our age, to pivot and learn some new skills. And if anything, COVID-19 has taught us is if we don't, we will not succeed.
Thank you very much. What a rich afternoon of discussion and ideas. And I want to close with an idea that has come from Abigail again. This evening, Abigail is the bastion of innovative thought. She is suggesting, Council will consider creation of a Caribbean reader on women leadership for inclusion in our schools. What an excellent idea. Caribbean reader text for inclusion. I think that's what you mean, Abigail, for inclusion in our school curriculum. Very good idea.
Yes, indeed. It is a way for us to celebrate ourselves, but also make it known to young women that we exist. Women leaders exist across our region.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And with that, I'd like to thank our panelists, thank participants for such a rich, engaging discussion. And I know that Sewell is extremely grateful for the ideas that we have generated here today, and that will inform their programming going forward. Thanks to all of you again, and hopefully with some of these ideas, we'll be able to enable some spaces across the region and inspire transformative leadership in different ways. Transformative leadership, as Mrs. Turner-Jones said, it's something, when you see it, you know it, it motivates you to change, it motivates you to lead, it motivates you to want to achieve and to deliver. It is personal, and it also recognizes service because it looks out for others. People resonate with these things. And these are also qualities that once you cultivate them, they are good things for ushering women leaders into decision-making positions across the region. So it's a good, I think, slew of things for Sewell to think about and for us to also chew on as we move forward in our various capacities across the region. Thank you very much again, panelists, for your contribution. Over to Sewell.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kremer. A really, really big thank you on behalf of the Sewell Regional Secretariat for moderating today. You've very eloquently synthesized many of the key points. You've challenged us to think, examine, and explore these ideas just a bit deeper, and certainly from different perspectives. To Her Excellency Ambassador Thompson, Mrs. Turner-Jones, and Representative Tonni Brodber, Sewell, as always, values your support. Your views and contributions today have left us all more grounded in principles of gender equality and good governance, and inspired us to embody these principles that we've been discussing today as we work toward more inclusive societies. And of course, to everyone who's taken the time this afternoon, out of their afternoon, to participate, we really do appreciate you taking that time. Thank you for attending another Sewell event. We have quite a lot of notes and advice from the panel as well as participants, and I think just that alone makes this event worth it. So again, we do hope you've been able to benefit from today's discussion. And on that note, unless Dilys or Lady Anande Trotman Joseph, unless you have any final parting words, for us?
Just thank you very much for this wonderful wealth of experience. And it was a pleasure to join you and to be among friends, old friends and sisters. I don't know, perhaps if Dilys has anything else to add, but thank you very much. And to, of course, our secretariat, thank you for your hard work in affording us this wonderful opportunity this afternoon.
Thank you all. Thank you, Tilly, and
you,
the team
everyone.
as well. Have a good evening all and stay
Have a good
safe.
evening, everyone.
Take care. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.